I think in some ways it's a really important question in a world which is awash with information as never before. So we need ways of sorting through all of this information that we're bombarded with. And it's going to get worse. So for the generation growing up, you are going to be bombarded with unbelievable amounts of information. And you're going to have to work out what's true, what are alternative facts, what are actually conspiracy theories. So research is going to be one of the few ways that we can test this out. So in consuming information, one going to need to understand research and research methods. It's probably going to be the only way that we can move forward to tackle some of the complex problems that the world is facing in a rational way. And I perhaps just want to say something about some of those problems, because the challenges that we face today are the kinds of problems where we need a different kind of research. COVID-19 and the pandemic has illustrated some of the challenges. We've seen a lot of bad information, for example, about vaccines and the harm they might do circulating. It's not actually research-based, so we need to be able to look at the research about the effectiveness of vaccines as opposed to not having a vaccine. That's going to be even more true in the future as we tackle the really complex challenges of climate change and planetary change. And that's going to become a major driver of pretty much everything in life, but certainly health and well-being. It will, for this generation, probably be the most important determinant of future health and well-being. And that needs a different kind of research to the kind of research that we are currently doing. So often we tend to do research in a field like public health, but we don't necessarily work with climate scientists. We don't necessarily work with ecologists. We don't necessarily work with political scientists and economists. And yet all of those research areas are going to be important in tackling a problem like climate change. So I would argue that research is going to become even more important than it has been in tackling these kinds of challenges. And with that, I want to recognize that research alone is not going to be enough. Politics really matters. Being able to communicate the findings of research really well are skills that perhaps my generation didn't really have, but which a new generation of researchers is certainly going to need to have. So research, you could say, was necessary, but it's not going to be sufficient to solve the problems that the world faces. Adolescence is an amazing time of life. It is the time where it's a time of creativity, where an individual begins to interact with the world beyond one's family of origin, where one takes a great deal of interest in what's happening with your friends, but the world beyond. It's a time of amazing discovery, creativity. It's a really transformative time, and it's a time when young people really have the opportunity to change the world, and young people do have this capacity to change the world. So that's why adolescence is important. And if one looks at health, what happens in adolescence lays a foundation for pretty much everything that happens later in life. Health, physical fitness, well-being, all of that are the foundations are laid in adolescence. We sometimes talk about the triple dividend of adolescent health. Investments in adolescent health are important because during the adolescent years, an individual acquires a whole lot of capabilities that are really important for later life. They're important in adolescence, but they're also important throughout life. And these are things like fitness. They're things like cognitive and emotional abilities. These are what you're acquiring during your adolescent years, and they underpin pretty much everything in life and success in life. It also lays a foundation for health right across the life course. So you peak in physical fitness at about the age of 21. And really, how you peak in physical fitness determines your risk for cardiovascular disease or heart disease, things like type 2 diabetes right across the life course. And there's a third arm to the triple dividend, because today's adolescents are going to be the next generation to parent. And believe it or not, we have the largest generation of adolescents there have ever been on planet Earth today. It's just 1.8 billion people aged 10 through to 24 years. It's an extraordinary time. So this is not only going to be the next generation to parent, but this is the next generation to ever parent, biggest generation to ever parent, sorry. And what you learn during your adolescent years lays the foundation for being a good parent. So for all of these reasons, adolescent health is really important. There's probably another reason, which is the second part of your question, which is the challenges that this generation of adolescents faces are really quite different in terms of health challenges from previous generations. I mentioned, the big one of climate change, and that really is looming large. However, we've had huge other changes, social and digital media. It's hard to think about it, but it's not much more than a decade since social media was introduced. A little more, but it's completely transformed everybody's life and has transformed the way in which young people interact with themselves and with the world. It's hard to think now about life without social media. And that also has benefits, possibly also has some risks in terms of health, and been some concerns there around mental health and body image, for example. But look, there's a whole lot of other changes that are happening that are really different to earlier generations. Nutritional change. So the world is going through what's called a nutrition transition. It's from a time of scarcity to a time of abundance in calories. And so what we have is with that nutrition transition, growing commercialization and marketing of food to all of us, but to younger people in particular. Younger people are always the trendsetters, and so they're the targets for marketing. Ultra-processed foods are really bad. They're bad for the individual, they're bad for the planet. And these are challenges that this generation face in terms of their health during their adolescent, young adult years. Obesity obviously goes along with that. And once you become obese as an adolescent, it's actually very hard to get back to a normal weight later in life. It's really a critical point in the life course where you can put behind childhood obesity. But if you become obese as an adolescent, it then becomes a real struggle to get back to a normal weight. Well, a few parts to that question. There's a little bit of a paradox here in terms of Australia and adolescent health, because we actually have been some of the most effective advocates for adolescent health over the last 20 years on the global stage. I'm not sure that we have necessarily seen all of the right policies adopted in Australia. Some people have characterized adolescence as, it's the stage at which you're healthiest, strongest, healthiest, fittest, smartest. And all of that is probably true. And yet the foundations for health across the life course and for the next generation are really laid during these years. So it's important for those reasons. But because adolescents don't have a conspicuous disease burden or health problems as older people do, they've had less attention. So Australia has had a benign neglect, you could say, of adolescent health. We haven't really been investing in the kinds of things one would want to invest in. Where we have invested in Australia, it's tended to be the priority of the day. If anybody knows any French, it's the issue du jour, is somehow as we describe it. So, 30 years ago it was HIV and sexually transmitted diseases. In the past, it's been concerned about drugs of different kinds. It's been concerned about suicide. More recently, it's been around mental health. We've never really adopted a comprehensive view of adolescent health, which is going to extend beyond simply seeing your GP on a regular basis. It's going to be about what happens in the schools in which you spend so many hours of the day. Are your schools healthy environments that promote good nutrition, physical activity, good mental health? And they're not always good on all of those areas. So we could be doing better in Australia. But Harish, your other question is, which countries are doing better? Well, if you look at the international rankings, probably the Netherlands comes out on top. So Holland is a place where young people seem to be doing well on many dimensions of adolescent health. So they're less obese. They seem to have less problems with early unwanted pregnancies, for example. Mental health profiles are not bad. They seem to be getting on well with life. And that's probably because of some of the things that they have around them. So for those of you who know the Netherlands, bike riding is something which everybody does, and they do from an early age. There's an incredible infrastructure for bike riding and for public transport, and that's really good for young people. Good in terms of having a transport network that can get you from A to B very easily and cheaply, but also very good for your health. And so those are the kinds of things places like the Netherlands have done. Sometimes worthwhile mentioning China as a place that is investing in adolescent health. And that's probably something to do with China having a declining fertility. So it's an aging population in China. And so they see young people as a really important resource for the future. Sometimes, you'll hear economists talking about human capital. But, it is the Chinese government sees young people as really important, and they see these big problems of obesity, mental health, myopia in China as things where there's a need for a national approach. And because China is a very top-down government, they seem to be able to do these things well. So those are two places that stand out for me as doing things differently. Well, that's an interesting and complex question, Harish. So there's a feeling around the world that what we've been doing with the war on drugs hasn't been working particularly well, and we may be doing more harm than good. And so there is this push in many countries for decriminalization, which is the first step. And then the second step is actual legalization of cannabis use. So decriminalization effectively means that if you're caught with a small amount of cannabis for your own personal use, you don't get a conviction. Legalization means that from a certain age, one is able to buy and use cannabis for whatever purpose, medically, legally, recreationally, without, when one can do that legally. So that's a trend which is happening around the world. It's happening because criminalization really hasn't worked. And governments do see some potential benefits. So for governments, if you have a legal product, you can tax it. So that's revenue for the government. So that's an incentive. And there are some other reasons. It makes it easier to use cannabis, which does have a role in the management of some chronic conditions, chronic pain in particular. So those are the reasons why people on the positive side are wanting to decriminalize and eventually legalize cannabis use. On the other side of the ledger, the current situation is one where you've got to go to a criminal network to buy cannabis effectively. So you're exposed to a group of individuals who you probably don't want to be exposed to. They're not necessarily the nicest people. You're exposed to other illicit drugs as well, and you might end up with a criminal conviction, which is a black mark that you hold for the rest of your life, effectively, or at least for a period of time, depending on the jurisdiction in which you're growing up or living. So people are feeling, look, we need to move to a different model. If you have a different model, which is a legal model, you can regulate a substance. So tobacco is the model. We currently control tobacco by taxing tobacco. Governments like this because it's a source of income, as I said, but it also means that you can not only control the price, but you can control what goes into the product as well. And so from a government perspective, that's good. You can also restrict the marketing of tobacco or cannabis to groups who you don't want to be using. Now, there's some trickiness in this because different jurisdictions or different places have introduced different laws around cannabis use with decriminalization. One of the really tricky issues is, well, what age do you decriminalize from, or what age do you legalize from? And that varies from about the age of 18 in some jurisdictions up to 21 in others. And there one's got to begin to think about, okay, pros and cons of cannabis use. What are the harms that might be associated with cannabis use? And there the evidence is that around mental health risks, for example, it's mostly very heavy use in younger people. So we're talking about up to the age of 16, and people who are using daily before the age of 16 seem to have a greater rate of problems in life in general, problems with education, problems with mental health. And so most people would feel that's a group where you wouldn't want, an age group where you wouldn't want to see cannabis use, and would want to, in moving to decriminalization, also adopt some other measures to restrict cannabis use in younger adolescents. How do you do that? We haven't been particularly good at developing, having the conversation about cannabis use with young people. We have in schools implemented some health education curricula. The evidence isn't great that that works particularly well. So one of the advantages with legalization is that we can begin to actually do some research into what is going to work to promote, a sensible use of cannabis in adults and avoid use in younger people. So that work hasn't happened, but my expectation is that this trend toward decriminalization, it's politically sensitive in a lot of countries. So it's not going to happen quickly, but it will happen with time.